I'm Kai, a 19-year-old artist from the UK. Today I want to talk about studying anatomy and using basic shapes to create interesting and dynamic figures. Beforehand, some other good videos to watch on anatomy are Chris Mason's, Third PHP's, Veil's, and Nero's. I'm definitely no expert when it comes to anatomy, but I wanted to share how I learned some of the stuff that I learned and also how you can learn in an easy way. First I'll go into detail on all the individual body parts, and then after that I'll sort of talk about how to actually study it. Let's get into it. Firstly, I want to talk about the most basic shapes that you will find in any anatomy tutorial out there. A lot of people bring this up because it is super important to learn these, because this is going to help you when you want to draw your anatomy in a lot of different angles. It also teaches you a lot of the fundamentals of art, like perspective and things like that, right from the gate. I'm just going to gloss over it just because a lot of people already covered this kind of stuff. And after that I went straight to showing what kind of shapes I personally use to construct my bodies. First I use a kind of cube for the rib cage, but occasionally I also use circles and ovals and things like that. Naturally the pelvis shape is its own thing, and I use cylinders for the legs and arms. And I'll be talking more in depth about all these body parts in a second. The first body part I wanted to go over was the arm. It's the most simple to explain, and I can get my point across quicker with this. Generally I focus on the perspective and form while I'm drawing these kinds of studies. Sort of making sure to follow the form of the arm with contours while I draw it. We want to make sure that every body part that we draw has some kind of form and 3D-ness to it so it doesn't feel super flat. Which means drawing the full cylinder at times and using that as a anchor point to draw everything else. Here I'm sort of showing the differences between different kinds of cylinders that you might draw if you use straight lines, if you use curved lines, or if you use lines that sort of come inwards. You might not think it, but those super small things can really make a big difference on how your arm feels and looks. And I don't think it's necessarily wrong to do it any kind of way, just as long as your style allows you to do it and it makes perfect sense. And as you can see here, I'm drawing a lot of different angles for the arms too, the under, the back of the arm. It's important to put your time into drawing the arm in all kinds of different angles, as well as all the other body parts too, because this is where a lot of the actual improvement comes in. Because when you challenge yourself and draw things that you're not comfortable with, you actually improve a lot at it and realize how it looks at a lot of different angles too. Using different perspectives and things like that can be super helpful too, I can't stress it enough. But using these super basic forms, we were able to put anatomy on top of this and make it make sense, which is generally the goal that you want to go for. And here I'm starting on the torso. As you can see here, I'm following the basic form and keeping in mind perspective while I draw it. And keeping this perspective in mind, or whatever perspective your character is in, is super important because the perspective is always going to affect the character. And even if your figure doesn't like it saying quote perspective, it always is, and perspective always affects the figure, regardless of if you notice it or not, or if it's an extreme one or not. So it's important to sort of base your cylinders and whatever other shapes you draw based on that. And I don't think a lot of people talk about the fact that you have to sort of use those basic shapes and keep them in a consistent perspective the whole time. And to get used to doing this, it could be good to trace over some references or other artists' work, and then you'll get a better idea of sort of the perspective that stuff is in and how to actually use that in your own work. I think Becker talks about this a lot. Something else to keep in mind, you should use a lot of different perspectives and shots for whatever you're studying. I think a lot of people study the most basic anatomy study they can find, and that doesn't help you when you're drawing a lot of different angles and shots. As you can see here, I'm drawing a lot of different shots and perspectives for my sort of character, and you need to learn to put anatomy on top of this and make it believable and accurate. Which is a super difficult thing to do at first, and it's going to look terrible, but over time, as it gets better, you're going to really be happy that you learned to do this. And you want to keep in mind following the basic form too. I'm using a square here, but the rib cage is actually more of a circle or oval, so I'm keeping in mind that form while I'm drawing sort of my basic anatomy on top. Next I'll be covering the basic shapes of the pelvis. This is probably one of the more complex ones to sort of learn to draw in perspective because it's not as simple as, a cube or a circle or anything like that. It's actually its own shape. Here I'm sort of showing how the skeleton affects the pelvis itself and everything around it. Since the femur comes out of the pelvis, it actually affects how sort of the edge of the leg looks. And when I draw the pelvis at different angles, I do tend to sort of resort to using a cube and just putting two lines in it sometimes. This makes it a lot easier to draw it at a lot of different angles. Sometimes this can make your cubes look a bit boxy though, so you really have to be careful with it if you do use it. You still need to find ways to make it look super organic and natural with the way the pelvis looks. You can see what I'm drawing here. I do typically use sort of shapes for this, but this one I kind of just freehanded for some reason. But even here I'm trying to follow the basic form. And here I'll draw the basic pelvis when one of the legs is up and the other one's sort of down. Which can be a very difficult thing to do and make it look natural and normal. But since I have more experience with it now, I'm getting used to it. Here I'll talk a little bit about the leg. I'm not as sort of versed on the anatomy in the leg as I am in the arm or torso or anything like that. So this is something I'm just basing purely off, mostly of reference. But as you can see, I'm drawing the basic torso and following sort of the wide point that the femur makes and following that while going down. And when it comes to leg overlap, it's important to sort of follow the shape of the cylinder and keep in mind that form and perspective to really make it seem like the leg is coming forward and the other one is going back. And it's the same with the knee too, following the basic sort of form that the perspective is showing and using that to sort of determine how you're going to draw the knee. As you can see, I try and keep my legs fairly simple with the way that I draw them and not put too much detail or muscle into them. Generally, you do want to keep in mind sort of balancing anatomy versus sort of stylization, because I think what some people do when they start learning anatomy is they start putting way too much detail into the muscles and anatomy, when manga and anime typically does not have that. Unless you're reading something like Becker or JoJo, there's typically not that much muscle definition in manga and anime. And I think when people, when they start learning anatomy, they want to show it off and put it into work a lot. Sometimes it's better to figure out what you want to do and sort of base your anatomy around that. So it's important not to overdo it unless that's sort of what you're going for, a Becky or JoJo kind of style. But just knowing these basic forms that happen underneath the muscles and things like that is important for you to actually draw anime and manga. And it's sort of, more evident than you might think when you look at manga and anime. The most basic sort of lines and shapes they use follow the basic forms of the muscles and skeleton underneath. It's all connected. As you can see here, I'm showing how I might study, different muscle groups or anything like that. Right now I'm studying the arm because it's the most easiest to show off and, it's the one that I know the best. When I study them, I typically do break them down into sort of bite-sized studies. So one day I might do the deltoid, the next day I might do the bicep. Basically learn the different muscle groups and the way that they connect and things like that is super important. But that's only assuming that you want to learn all the muscles in their entirety. I think if you know the basics, proportion, form, things like that, you might be good off learning sort of the names and everything, but you should still know that they exist and their form and things like that, because it does affect the way that you draw a lot. But you should still be drawing all these in different angles, like I said earlier, and a lot of different perspectives and things like that, because that will help a lot. And I'm going to draw some sketches of sort of putting everything that I talked about here into practice, using sort of the basic shapes and forms to create a body. As you can see here, I'm following the most basic perspective and keeping in mind something that's super important, which is overlap. Overlap is one of the more important things when you're drawing and things like that, just because it adds a lot of depth and it shows what's in front of something and what's behind something. And when you draw in perspective, using overlap really does help a lot, and it really sells that, something is close to the camera or something's further away. Definitely one of the more important things to look out for and keep in mind. Here I'm moving on to the next figure. I'm keeping in mind overlap and keeping the basic shapes that I have here in perspective in a way that they're supposed to be. Or at least as best I can. I don't think the perspective necessarily has to be perfect, but as long as the majority does follow, it really does help in sort of creating a figure that looks like it's actually in perspective or it's actually 3D. As you can see here, I'm drawing a below angle, which is typically something I do struggle with, but this one wasn't as bad as I thought it might be. Drawing in the basic forms and keeping them sort of accurate to the way that the ribcage forms. Also keeping up the contour lines while I draw. keeping the shapes in perspective too, as we already know. Here I'm drawing a figure sitting. I think a lot of people are wondering how much anatomy you actually need to make, manga or anime drawings. And I think the answer for that does differ a lot, just because a lot of different people's styles and things like that. But, generally I do think that having the basic, proportions, landmarks, basic form, things like that, once you have that down, you're able to draw basic shapes like this and turn them into characters, I think that's typically all you need. You don't necessarily have to know all the muscle names or anything like that. We are sort of anime manga artists after all, we're not necessarily like, making an anatomy book or anything like that. Since gesture drawing didn't help me too much, and I wondered if there might be other people out there like me, I decided to talk a little bit about sort of figure drawing instead, or in place of gesture drawing, because you can make a figure dynamic even if you're not using gesture per se. And with the way that I draw, I can't necessarily use gesture to actually, use on my figure and make it something that I can go over and make into a finished piece. But with the way that I draw my figure drawing, I can actually do that, and it's very helpful for me. But essentially keeping in mind sort of the basic things that I'm showing here, which is sort of tilting the torso itself and tilting the pelvis too. In addition, the way that the sort of gravity from the foot comes up and knocks the pelvis up is the reason why the torso actually tilts, because it's counterbalancing what the pelvis is tilting from. So to put it simply, the leg that carries most of the weight is actually going to push up the pelvis, and it's going to make it tilt. And when the pelvis tilts, the torso has to tilt so that it counterbalances the pelvis, so that the figure can stay straight and is able to stand. Keeping this in mind really helped me when I was drawing figures and things like that. And the basic principles of squash and stretch applies to some of the figures' torsos. So when one side of the figure actually contracts, the other extends to sort of counterbalance and things like that. And when you do these things, they actually make your figures a lot more dynamic. I'm showing it again here. The basic place where the weight is, plus where the squash and stretch is. But basically, if you apply all these principles, you're going to come up with a figure that's naturally dynamic anyway. So gesture isn't necessarily something that I wouldn't recommend, but for me personally, I didn't really understand it, and it's very difficult for me to learn it, myself anyway. So the way that I actually learned was just by doing figure drawings naturally on something that I can actually use. And this helped me a lot when I was studying proportion and things like that as I was starting out. And since the video is ending, I just wanted to compile everything and sort of tell you how to actually study. So first, learning the major shapes is important. And then sort of after that, you want to study the muscles super bite-sized. So, start with a deltoid, start with a bicep, start with a pectoral. And as you go forward, you sort of add more and more, and then eventually you're going to be able to draw the whole figure. As long as you're using different angles and perspectives when you're learning, it's going to be a lot easier for you to sort of draw in general in a lot of different angles. Generally, you're not going to learn how to draw in perspective or anything like that if you don't study it. That's all from me though. Like and subscribe if you liked the video. Peace out.